What's up, everybody? Welcome to Yogz podcast episode 2. This week, myself and Souph, we're going to be getting into some of the details of the upcoming UFC 249 card, and we're going to be giving you some of our picks and letting you know how we think the card is going to play out. Souph?
Yes, Lewis. What's going on?
Yes, man. So we made it. We finally made it. It feels crazy to say we're actually at fight week, right?
It's surreal. I mean, I think we just sort of a lot of people have said that I think they thought that mixed martial arts was going to be the first sport back before the other ones closed down. So, I mean, as a fan, I'm excited. I'm slightly anxious about how the event will go, but I can't lie and say that I'm not excited for this weekend's card.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think I touched on it in the last episode. Dana White was very kind of cavalier and very intent on getting things back up and running as soon as possible. As far as trying to make attempts at getting the card to happen during quarantine, obviously tried to get it done on Tachi Palace in California until the governor had to step in. So it's kind of like, it's been a roller coaster. Obviously, the card doesn't look the way we anticipated it looking. But at this point in time, I would accept. I'd accept anything. So, did obviously you caught the Brasilia card, right? The final one before quarantine or lockdown started.
I did.
That card was our first glimpse into a UFC card with no audience. And how did you find that?
It was. I mean, we've seen quite intimate UFC fights before. Like, if anyone's watched like the Ultimate Fighter fights or the Tuesday Night Contender series that Dana White will sometimes put on, there's obviously minimal people in the crowd. You still hear people cheering and shouting. It's very intimate. It's just and you can hear, just these minor details. You can hear the feet like moving across the canvas. You hear the punches connect. It's a lot more. It's definitely a different experience when you see and hear a crowd, like let's say in the T-Mobile Arena in Vegas. It's a very different atmosphere.
Sure.
It always makes it a bit more sort of chilling.
It does.
Slightly. It's kind of like a nightclub. Like I remember one time at university, I had this surreal experience where it was one of those silent discos, and I removed my headphones and I just see a sea of people like jumping and going nuts and wild in the crowd, and there's no music. And I was like, it came to this realization where I was like, this is actually mental. And I think it's a similar sort of thing. Like, it's just this, there's no crowd, there's no alcohol, there's no people cheering, there's no noise. It's just two people in the center of an octagon beating the crap out of each other. Yeah. So it kind of just removes all the context, and you just see it for what it is. And there's something quite, I don't know. Quite primal about it. Yeah, exactly.
And it's funny because on that Brasilia card, I mean, in the Gilbert Burns versus Damian Maia fight, when he connected with that overhand onto Damian Maia, the way Damian Maia's head hit the canvas, I was like, wow, this is actually like somebody's brain rattling, right? And of course, as long-time spectators of combat sports, we know the risks, we know the ramifications of what these guys and girls are doing. But I think it does kind of reinforce the fact that this is a high stakes sport with like serious injuries. People are getting hit hard. So yeah, the lack of crowd was definitely unusual. The fighters didn't seem to have a problem with turning it on.
Exactly. Those performances on that card were awesome. Some of the performances.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I mean, ordinarily the support of the home crowd feeds into the home fighter, right? So, in Brazil, you expect the Brazilian fighters to feed off that. And then actually on that card, Oliveira and Burns looked amazing. And they were both Brazilians, and they didn't seem to miss a step because there was no crowd. So I don't know what conclusions we can draw from that, but I'm sure that these people are going to come to fight on Saturday. It's going to be in Florida, right? So we've got 3 cards in the space of 10 days, all in Jacksonville. Is that right?
I think so. I think they're all in. Yeah, they're definitely all in Florida. Yeah. I don't know if they're all at the same event, same location, but definitely I think they're all to be located in the same state. Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, Florida was obviously probably the only place that the UFC could go to and safely get the card going. Obviously, out here in California, they were not going to let that fly, even though it was on native land. So I mean, again, we touched on this in the last episode, but it's kind of it does make the sport look a little bad and a little kind of maverick and underground by still putting on a show during this time. But I think the difference at this point in time versus 4 weeks ago when it was initially supposed to happen is that things have simmered down a little bit, and it feels like it's a better time to do the card. So I feel less weird and less conflicted about watching this.
Yeah, I think enough time has passed, and I think people are definitely, the sentiment is people are just ready to get back to normalcy. That's even in not just like the fans, but also like a lot of the media members. They've kind of changed their stance on it as well. So they're like kind of like, yeah, I think, you know, as long as they're following precautions and as long as there's government buy-in and there's some sort of like rules and regulations around it, I think people are kind of happy to get back to the fights. Basically, I think they feel like enough time has passed, and they feel like if we've got the right precautions in place and we put the right steps and measures in place, and hopefully we can have a safe event where there isn't this, you know, an outbreak of a coronavirus.
Yeah, that's it, right? They have to take all reasonable precautions. You'd like to think that there's testing taking place, but I mean, it does kind of speak to a bigger point that eventually things will have to get back to normal, and maybe this is the catalyst, you know, to kind of spur the rest of the sports world to kind of take these steps to get back up and running. Because I mean, what some people say, oh, it's only sport, but it's such a huge economic model, right? It creates so much money, it generates so much money for local economies, and also, yeah, it's just like a beloved form of entertainment. So maybe this is what's going to spark that, right? When they see that these big events are taking place. So yeah, I'm hopeful because I don't want to lose, like, you know, the whole year, because they can't put every card in. Maybe they can put every card in Florida, but yeah, I mean, and also, I mean, which is also because of the restrictions on travel, right? I mean, this is obviously a card with fighters that are exclusively based in the US, right? That's not going to be sustainable, right? Some of the biggest stars in the sports do not live in the US. Mm-hmm. So, you know, eventually we're going to have to get some sort of arrangement where they can come in and fight.
Yeah, I think that's the next step, isn't it? It's the next step where hopefully we get to a stage where travel can be, or like where it's like heavily monitored, and like they can somehow get athletes from across the world round to come to the US or wherever it is that's required, and try to put back on. Yeah, because this is the thing, like we don't actually know like how long it's going to be before sports can resume back to normal with like crowds, because it's probably going to be more than a year, until we have a vaccine, really, that they're going to be allowed to host events with, you know, over 10,000 people or however many people. So I think, you know, these crowdless fights are going to be the new normal.
Yeah.
For a while. Like I said, I'm just happy we've got something to talk about. I'm happy there's 3, you know, quite, you know, interesting events lined up. I'm really excited to get into talk about the card. Definitely,
man. And that's it. Like, this card actually does have storylines. I mean, it looks a lot different to what we expected it. Right, some of these fights were not on the horizon that, you know, pre-coronavirus. So full of storylines. I mean, just there's a few interesting matchups, interesting to say the least. So a guy that we actually really watched a lot of back in the day on The Ultimate Fighter, Uriah Hall.
Or when he burst onto the scene was it tough 19 or tough 20?
It might have been 20, yeah.
It was a John Jones, Chael Sonnen season, wasn't it?
Yeah. Uriah Hall's a guy that, what can be said about him, the expectations people had for him, his athleticism, his style, drew a lot of comparisons to Anderson Silva at the time, and things have just not really panned out for him the way people expected.
Yeah, I mean, on the show, he had the knockout of the century against Adam Cheller, that's it. And then he was blasting everyone, like high expectations coming off the Ultimate Fighter, fall short against Kelvin Gastelum in the finale. And then from there on, it was kind of like a series of, he had some moments of brilliance. Yeah. Like, he's had some crazy fights and some really redeeming moments. One that springs to mind is when he broke his foot, or he broke his toe in the Thiago Santos fight, I think it was. Yeah. And he just continued to fight on, and he won the fight. There's some, and the awesome knockout from Krzysztof Jotko.
Yeah, and
he's had some really good fights.
The first Masasi fight.
Oh, of course, yeah, the spinning heel kick to the head.
Crazy.
Yeah, he was highly touted, and I think people had like super high expectations. They thought he was, you know, predestined to be the, you know, next champion of the middleweight division. Mm-hmm. Hasn't panned out, but, you know, when he shows up, it's going to be a good fight. more often than not, you get a good fight with Uriah Hall. So the matchup with Jacare Souza is actually quite an interesting one.
The thing about Uriah Hall, some of the competition he's lost to, Gegard Mousasi, obviously he lost in the rematch. Whittaker, former champion. Paulo Costa, title contender. So, he's not losing to bums, but I think it's the fact that he's failed to show any consistency over his career. Obviously had that major health scare a couple of years ago when by all accounts, he had a seizure due to weight cutting. But he's looked really good in his last couple of fights. He actually knocked out Bevon Lewis at 2-3-2. I was actually at that card in LA. It was really great to see him come back and make a statement performance. And, he spoke afterwards about his sister, and he was really emotional. And he seems a guy that really does live in his own head. He seems to have a lot of issues mentally with the sport. And I really hope that he's kind of got over that now. But, going into this matchup, I think he's fighting a guy who's seen it all, right? Against Jacare Souza.
I mean, Jacare Souza, he's always a contender. Jacare Souza, I feel, is one of them guys. He's been so close to the title so many times, and he's just, for whatever reason, fallen short. But he snaps up any competition. I used snap up as his moniker would suggest. But he literally destroys these like mid-level opposition. And then he gets to a point where he has to fight a Robert Whittaker, a Yoel Romero, he lost recently to, is it Jack Hermansson?
Yeah, he lost to Hermansson, and then he went up to 205 and lost to Blachowicz.
So this fight is a return to middleweight.
Yeah, so I believe so. Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, but so Jacare Souza, I mean, he's got all the tools to be a contender. I do wonder now. I mean, he must be how old is he now?
40 years old.
40 years old. I mean, for middleweight division, that is quite advanced.
Yeah.
So obviously, sadly, I don't think we'll see Jacare holding the middleweight title, but I'm really interested to see how this fight. It's a classic striker versus grappler, isn't it?
It is, and I think
this fight
it's really interesting matchmaking as well, because obviously Jacare is the bigger name, but Jacare is coming off 2 defeats, and Hall is on a 2-fight win streak. So this is a real pivotal fight, I think, for both of them. It's an opportunity for Jacare to snap the skid, and it's an opportunity for Hall to arguably beat his biggest name opponent, or get his biggest name victory, and continue his best win streak in the organization. So it'll be really interesting to see. He's got an interesting striking style, because he's got head kick KOs on his record, right? But he's a person that we strongly considered to be a grappler, right? Which he is. He's a world champion jiu-jitsu player. I think if he goes out there and tries to stand with Uriah Hall, it could be problematic for him, right?
I think so. I think his path to victory is to play to his strengths, and he is a force to be reckoned with on the feet. I mean, he's got power in both hands, and like you said, even in his kicks and in his head kicks, he has a lot of power. So he is a threat on the feet. But I think most would agree his best chances of winning this fight is to try and take it to the floor. The distance between him and Uriah Hall on the ground is insurmountable. Like his jiu-jitsu game is absolutely amazing. I think he's probably the best grappler in terms of jiu-jitsu, in terms of and credentials to ever fight in the UFC. Because I think when I say grappler, I mean purely jiu-jitsu. Because I think he'd only be rivaled by Damian Maia, but he beat Damian Maia in a few jiu-jitsu tournaments. So. Right. That would be that would be my guess. The best way, his easiest path to victory. Yeah. Trying to get Uriah Hall out of there. And
that's it. I mean, there's no on the feet. Credentialed strikers can be beaten by unheralded strikers, like we were talking about with Overeem. He loses to people that in a pure striking contest he would never lose, right? But that's not happening in grappling. You're not getting a lucky submission over a world champion jiu-jitsu player, really. No. that golf is completely different than it is on the feet. So, I mean, I'd have to agree with you about Jacare, the best grappler we've seen in the sport. And it's interesting because also we've got Verdum on the same card too, which we could probably segue into. Verdum, obviously highly decorated, Abu Dhabi's Jiu-Jitsu Worlds, and he's been out for 2 years, so he's going to be coming back. He's fighting Alexei Oleinik, right? So this is, if we're talking about So that's a good pivot into this fight, right? So Doom's been out for what, 2 years?
Yeah, suspension, wasn't it? A drug suspension. So yeah, it has been about 2 years. Yeah.
So I mean that's a long time to be out the cage, especially as a 42-year-old. And I don't know how he's going to look coming back, right? I mean it's hard to know. If he had been using PEDs for a long period of time and now he's not, you know, that's when we tend to see a big drop off in a fighter's performance.
Yeah, I mean that is the case. One of my earliest memories of Verdum is he had a fight with Alistair Overeem in Strikeforce, and he kept pulling guard, or he kept pretending to be hurt, and then Overeem just wasn't even going to like entertain the idea of going to the ground with him. And for a long time, that was Fabricio Verdum. He pissed a lot of people off. And a lot of people were just like, this guy's whack, and they never really gave him the credit that he deserved. And then after that, he started, you know, learning a bit more striking on his feet, becoming a lot more efficient, chaining the game together, and, you know, really, really honing on his craft. He submitted Fedor, had a few other great performances in Strikeforce, and then came over to the UFC, beat a few Roy Nelson, Nogueira, and then obviously Cain Velasquez, and then and Mark Hunt as well. Yeah, and then there was a point where, you know, during his title reign, people considered him one of the greatest heavyweights to walk the planet. Correct. And then that fight with Stipe Miocic, I think that was probably one of the, like, he didn't get the rematch with Stipe. It was such a weird fight because he was rushing forward against a skilled striker like Miocic, and, you know, he lost the title. Yeah. And then since then, he hasn't really been able to, you know, get back to title contention. So yeah, this is an interesting fight. I mean, Alexei Oleinik, this is his almost 80th fight. I mean, every time he fights, I'm always just blown away by the statistics of his career. You know, because he's won more fights by submission than most fighters have had. Period. He's got, I think, on his record, he's got 46 submissions. That's mental.
He's got 46 wins by submission.
Yeah, no, he does. Yeah,
which is crazy. So, and I mean, you know, he's an interesting character. So they're both 42-year-olds going into this fight. But I mean, for Oleinik, there is really only one path to victory that he chooses in his career. I don't mean in this fight. I mean generally, right? His last win by a method other than submission was 6 years ago. He only wins by submission, generally speaking, right? And against a lot of fighters, that's fine. But when you're fighting a competitor with the caliber of jiu-jitsu that Verdum has, that is not a realistic path to victory. Yeah,
no, I'd agree. You're not like you said, like we said earlier in the chat, like, you're not really going to catch someone in a lucky submission. I mean, you could hurt somebody and get them in a submission. That's entirely plausible. I'm even thinking of when Jack Hermansson almost caught Jacare in a guillotine, and it was his special move that he. Everyone in jiu-jitsu has their move, like they have something that they're very good at. And Jack Hermansson got that on Jacare. Yes, it was close, but even then, whether it's pride, whether it's technique, whatever it is, somehow Jacare managed to, you know, correctly defended it, got his hips to the ground, turned his hips back and forth, and he was able to get out of the guillotine. So yeah, I think the chances of Oleinik catching Fabricio Verdum in a submission when they both have their wits about them, it's almost zero.
Yeah. You see it so often that these people with this very specified skill set, it almost negates each other. As recently as Colby versus Usman, right, back in December. It's two guys, credentialed wrestlers, and they've got a grappling-centric style. Not one takedown in 5 rounds, right? So I do wonder if this will be a situation where both men decide to keep it standing and try to, like, you know, slog to a possibly boring victory.
And, you know, Verdum's been off for 2 years and he's 42. Yeah. And he hasn't been active in terms of competition. I mean, Oleinik has been, like you said, he's been active. He's even been competing in some grappling matches. Granted, it didn't last particularly long against Gordon Ryan, but he has been the more active out of the two. So, I don't have high hopes for this being an emphatic performance from either person in this fight. But it's you know, it'll be interesting to see. Verdum could come out and completely shock me, and then blast this guy in a matter of seconds. But I don't know. I guess we'll see.
We are going to save our picks for the end of the show, so we're not going to give those away just yet. Yep. But if we are talking about picks, I know Verdum has got a special place in your heart, right? Do you want to share that story?
Oh yeah, shit. Sorry. Yeah. Bad. How did I forget that? Yeah, bad. So Verdum has a very special place in my heart. Yeah, he has a very special place in my heart. I had a bet I think it was 13-fold accumulator on that card in Mexico where he beat Cain Velasquez to win the heavyweight
accumulator's
championship.
a parlay for our American listeners out there.
Yeah, so I had a bet on, I think 8 out of the 13 bets were all underdogs as well. And Verdun was a big underdog going into that fight. Yeah, they didn't really give him much of a chance, but you know, being the wily veteran that I am, I put £2 on a 13-fight accumulator. Yeah, that paid off. That was awesome. That was a great moment. I can't believe I forgot that. You know, you mentioned that. I was like, oh, what are you talking about?
Big win, wasn't it? It was a big win.
Yeah, it was like £3,500. Yeah, so that was pretty
cool. So other stories on this card. In terms of name recognition, the most well-known fight on the card would be Cerrone and Pettis. So yeah, I mean, I kind of touched on my opinions on Pettis in the last episode.
You made them very clear in the last chat.
And I just realized I'm one of those people. People are going to probably give me heat for that. And I did kind of want to kind of flesh that out a little bit more. But you know, these are two guys that I'm not fans of. But yeah. What do you make of this one?
This fight, yeah. I mean, it's strange, isn't it, that this fight is placed on the preliminary card. They're doing that in order for people to tune in and buy the pay-per-view, I imagine, on the free card that's on ESPN. But I mean, I can't remember the last time either Donald Cerrone or Anthony Pettis were on a preliminary card.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You know, so do you know what I mean? I can't remember if not the main event, they're the co-main event, or they're almost certainly on the main card. And I think that is forecasting of where they are in their career. You know, they have a lot of name value, but I think, you know, Pettis, his title hopes are, you know, like as you were obviously last week when he talked about Pettis. I mean, you could have said it. You know, you were very honest with your opinion of him, and I think you're right. Like, I think he does make, for whatever reason, there was a massive fall from grace from when he had the lightweight championship. Whether that could be down to numerous reasons, whether it's down to willpower or interest in the game, whether it's just turn up for a paycheck, whether it's just he got by on a certain set of skills that are no longer you know, as valuable as they were, and he just the game passed him by, kind of thing. I'm not too sure what it is.
I feel like you're not addressing the elephant in the room, but I respect it.
What's it? Or like performance?
Yeah, I mean, it is possible, right? I mean, I'm not going to point fingers. I'm not, but I mean, that was one of the accusations that was leveled at Pettis. You know, after this fall from grace, which has seen him lose, I think, 8 of his last 12. Right, that was one of the kind of, he was one of the fighters people were pointing fingers at.
Yeah, he was definitely. Yeah, that's right. But I think, this fight is. I don't even want to say, because I mean, I'm a fan of Donald Cerrone. I'm a fan of his fight style. I'm a fan of his kind of like, he's a bit of a tip of the hat to like the old generation, where it's like, just fight, who gives a crap, training camp, never heard of it, I don't give a crap about it. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I'll just put me in a cage. We've kind of slightly moved past that, and people are a bit more sort of selective. Particularly when they start to get a name value like he has. There's something kind of admirable. He has a name and he's willing to fight anybody. You know, think of like the Aaron Hernandez fight. He's had some crazy, like really good performances where he's fought people he didn't have to fight necessarily, and he's had some amazing performances. But yeah, I think this fight is rightly placed on the preliminary card. They've got some name value, but in terms of, you know, world-class talent and like interest in like title contendership, these two, unfortunately, I don't think they'll be realizing that, particularly in the welterweight division where this fight's taking place anytime
agreed
soon.
Yeah, agreed. The welterweight division is not a nice place to be if you're on the downward slope of your career. Greg Hardy, he's fighting, you know, he trains out of Florida, so it's a local fight for him. I'm not sure about either of these guys. Hardy, you know, came into the game with a big name because of his athletic background and the controversy around him. Still really not sure where his talents lie and how deep they go. Two big heavyweights, two powerful heavyweights that aren't particularly well-rounded, provides highlight knockouts, etc., but not the most compelling storyline for me there.
No, I'd agree. I mean, it's you know, it's on there because of Greg Hardy, the story behind him, like you said, about the controversy that he found himself in during his career in the NFL, and what ultimately led him to, you know, pursue a career in MMA. I think Jorgen De Castro, you said about big heavyweights, man. This guy could be a welterweight. This guy's thick. Damn. Like 7 C's, like literally, like yeah, he's a big boy, man. There's not too much to get excited about for this card, for this particular fight on the main card. I'm kind of with you on that. It's like with heavyweight fights in particular, it can become very, very boring very quickly. When it's become very obvious that neither of them are going to knock each other out, and neither of them are skilled enough to, like, they're not like usually like super skilled, like dying around doing really you know, acrobatic movements where you can kind of, you know, watch in that way. They're normally really heavy footed, labored in some of their movements, and particularly as well, these guys are quite young in their career as well, so they're still figuring a lot of things out.
Agree. That's a really good point. They're both, you know, less than 10 professional fights, I believe. And yeah, I think, you know, we've seen even some of the most entertaining heavyweights of the modern era fight each other and have very boring fights. I mean, obviously Derek Lewis and Ngannou comes to mind, right? So it's tough for heavyweights. Yeah, no, it's tough. Exactly. All right, you give me a fight. So what do you want to talk about?
So yeah, on the main card as well, we, you know, on the topic of heavyweights, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the third fight on the card, which is Francis Ngannou versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik. What's your opinions on that?
Yeah, I mean, coming off the back of the fight we just discussed, that's really interesting, right? Because this fight to me does show that the gulf in class in the heavyweights, right? I mean, Francis Ngannou is a former title contender, and he's constantly at the door of a title shot. And Jairzinho is a guy we've come in and seen win with 4 knockouts in the last what year? He's came from nowhere. So this is an interesting fight to me. I feel like Ngannou has kind of been backed into a corner where he had to take this because he wanted that title shot. He's out of favor with the organization, so he really needs to make a statement in this fight, which I think is a scary proposition for anyone facing him, because that's not a man that you want to have, you know, a bee in his bonnet, right? He's a scary dude.
He's a big, scary dude. I mean, Jairzinho Rozenstruik as well. Like his last fight with Alistair Overeem, that was, I mean, it was quite an interesting fight. It was back and forth. He took a lot of shots in that fight. It showed that he's got a tremendous chin and that he has power up until the 5th round, which is something that, I mean, most heavyweights will have. But he still had that explosive power. And that he could cover distance. He's not the biggest heavyweight, but his striking prowess and his accuracy, that poses some interesting challenges for that division. One thing that I wanted to talk about with this fight in particular, interim titles. Now, everyone hates, like, you know, the discussion of interim titles or whether they're legitimate or not. And I wanted to ask you your opinion on this. Stipe Miocic has basically, who is the current heavyweight champion of the UFC, there's talks of him fighting Daniel Cormier for the rubber match. He's lost to Daniel, and he beat Daniel Cormier in their last fight. He's come out and said, "I'm not planning on defending my title until this coronavirus until we have a vaccine, pretty much, or until it's safe to go out." Which you know, when is that? And if his next fight is with Daniel Cormier, and you know, that's going to tie up the division for what, another year? Like we don't know how long. So there are a lot of people who have been kind of clamoring for this fight to be an interim title fight, and I wonder what's your kind of take on that?
I haven't heard the noise about that and the call for it to be an interim title. And you know, it's normally the opposite, right? We're normally berating the organization for making interim title fights. But this is one of those situations where it would really make sense to me, because all that would do would add more to the eventual fight when it happens, right? Yeah, no, it would make sense. I think Stipe DC3 is the fight to make. I think we have to see that both fights were fascinating. The first one obviously ended the way it did. The second one was a classic. I thought it was a great fight. So I would like to see the third. I respect Stipe's decision not to fight during coronavirus, but yeah, that would give plenty of justification for making this an interim fight. Ngannou took such a big reputational hit after those 2 fights, one with Stipe and one with Derek Lewis. His reputation was really damaged by that, but he's come back from that Derek Lewis fight and he's looked great. Yeah, I think he really wants that title.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I do think, you know, if we're handing out interim titles to, who do they give a shit interim title to?
Colby.
I mean, yeah, the interim title. Yeah, we're Colby. The interim title they've kind of the UFC have kind of made a bit of a mockery of it. You know, they've handed it out and they've taken it away, and it could have served a really good purpose. And in terms of like defining and securing that number one contender spot, because that's essentially what it is, really, isn't it? That's what the interim title belt is. So I think, you know, the winner of this fight undoubtedly is going to be the next contender in line. But yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, if you're gonna you know, hand out titles, I think this is definitely a circumstance that would warrant that as well. Okay, and then moving on from the Ngannou fight and the Rosenstruck fight, we have next up on the bill is the Cejudo and Cruz matchup, which was originally supposed to be Cejudo versus Aldo, and obviously because that was supposed to take place in Brazil, obviously Jose Aldo, that's where he lives, so he's unable to travel, and in steps in Dominic Cruz, who has been off 4 years since the injury, and his last fight was a loss to Cody Garbrandt, where he lost the title. And then here he's challenging again for the bantamweight belt against Henry Cejudo, who was newly crowned, defended it against Marlon. No, he won the title in a fight with Marlon Moraes, and this is his first title defense. So yeah, kind of, how do you see this fight playing out?
Man, you talk about narratives of this card, and I think Dominic Cruz, more than most fighters in the world, has a rich storyline behind his career. He's a guy that, you know, he's been plagued by injuries, and then we see these glimpses of brilliance, and you know, he comes back from injury, performs well, gets the title back against Dillashaw, loses it to defends against Faber, and then obviously the loss that you mentioned to Cody. And it's like, you know, that's the second time we've seen this big career comeback from him. And now he's trying to do it a third time with a longer layoff, a 4-year layoff. So I say all that to say there's so much going into this story-wise, and I guess the big question is just about what Cruz is like after 4 years off, right? I mean, he's been outspoken about not believing in ring rust, but after 4 years, 3 ACL surgeries, I think the most recent one was a broken arm or a shoulder surgery. You know, it's just a laundry list of problems. I've got opinions about Cejudo, and it's going to sound strange for somebody that is a champion of 2 divisions. You know, who's 125, 135 champ. I feel like I haven't seen enough of him to know his quality. And when I say that, you know, I know it sounds crazy because he's got 2 belts, but before his first loss to Demetrius Johnson, right, he had an unspectacular run in the UFC at 125, right? Missed weight a couple times, and he didn't do anything spectacular, right? He ground out some decisions, some close, some not so close. Lost the DJ fight convincingly, and I think at that point people said, well, this guy's probably not going to make it back to the title shot anytime soon. Came off the Ultimate Fighter, had another loss, and then, you know, he got back on track against that fight. Was it Wilson Hayes?
Wilson Hayes, yeah, that's his he knockout win, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, he came out with this different style, and people were raving about him, and he kind of rode that wave back to a title shot against DJ and ended up winning. Now, I know in that fight, you know, to beat someone like Demetrius Johnson, who in that weight class was definitely you know, you have to kind of tip your hat to that. It was a close fight, and I do kind of question where DJ was in that fight, you know, come to the end of his contract, etc. That being said, he went on to beat Dillashaw, but again, that's a fight that was over so quickly, it's hard to make any conclusions from it. And then the Moraes fight, which, look, I've been a Moraes fan for a long time, and I really expected him to sort of dominate the fight. And for the first round, I mean, you know, it did look like that's how it was going to play out. Yeah, yeah.
Marlon was completely dominated the first round.
Yeah,
yeah.
when I watched the fight, I saw it as Marlon, kind of fell off a cliff. I watched it back the other day and I realized actually he didn't fall off a cliff. He was pushed off a cliff. Henry Cejudo took him to that place. He was connecting. He was hitting him with a lot of, I think it was a straight right he was connecting with, and he really pushed Moraes to that place. Cejudo is not a cultured striker. He's not a person who is going to pick you apart from the outside, but he's got that tenacity and he's got the athleticism to get to the target, the explosiveness, and to connect with big punches. So that being said, I don't see this being a situation where he's going to try and outpoint Cruz over 5 rounds. How about you?
The biggest narrative for me going into this fight is Cruz. If he is able to capture the bantamweight title again, he will go down. He's already on. He's widely considered one of the sort of greatest minds of the sport. Definitely one of the best bantamweights, if not the best bantamweights ever in the history of mixed martial arts. But if he's able to recapture the bantamweight title from Henry Cejudo, for me, in my books, he goes down as one of the all-time greats and the comeback king. That's easily Dominic Cruz that's probably one of the most craziest feats in sports. Like if he's able to come back from the amount of setbacks that he's had and win a title, an amazing feat. Will he be able to do it? I don't know. It would be a huge ask. And again, like you said, the last time we saw him in the cage he was getting outstruck quite handily by Cody Garbrandt. Yeah, that for me, that's the storyline going into this.
Cool. So that brings us to the main event of the evening, right? Which would be El Cucuy, Tony Ferguson against the highlight, Justin Gaethje. So that is obviously another fight which has a rich storyline behind it. Primarily because of Tony Ferguson and everything that he's been through over the last few years. Obviously, we went into this expecting to see Tony versus Khabib, and then obviously due to COVID, it got derailed, and this is the fight we've now got. This is a chance for Tony Ferguson to extend that 12-fight winning streak and almost certainly then secure a title shot against Khabib, because this is for an interim title after all. Depending on whether or not you believe what Dana White says, we're hoping they make that fight for a 6th time. But I think it would be foolish to look beyond this fight for Tony Ferguson and kind of look beyond Gaethje, because from what we've seen from Gaethje in his UFC run alone, and then if you were watching him in the WSOF, this guy is a dog. And I think a theme that's come up in this episode, we've spoken about a couple of times with regards to Pettis and Cerrone maybe not having it, Henry Cejudo showing it, that ability to be a dog and to show that tenacity and go to that dark place, right? When a fighter doesn't have it, it's very noticeable. We've seen both of these men have that in abundance, right?
100%. One thing I want to that you mentioned about almost, if Tony Ferguson is able to get past able to get past Gaethje, it's kind of a no-brainer to make the Khabib fight. But Dana White has in a few, I think it was an interview with, was it Reddit? I think it was like a Reddit Q&A or something, where he was basically saying that verbatim was, Tony and Khabib is the fight that never was, or the fight that got away. But that aside, if you want to talk about savages, these two are probably the most savage people in this division. This is kind of like a dream matchup. Obviously, circumstances, we would love to have seen Tony Ferguson versus Khabib to kind of put the debate to rest. Who is the greatest fighter in that lightweight division? This is a close second place, and I'm not mad at this fight. I'm actually really excited that we're getting to see these two step into the octagon and face each other.
Absolutely. I mean, on paper, it really is a dream matchup. I mean, since Gaethje came into the organization, it has just been a non-stop roller coaster of highlights. Talk about the perfect nickname, right? Non-stop highlights. I mean, he's going into his seventh fight in the organization, right? And what he's achieved in under 3 years is just unbelievable. 7 bonuses in 6 fights, which is just unbelievable. Last 3 victories, all coming by way of knockout in the first round. Even his defeats, he makes his opponent go into deep water.
Yeah, exactly. He took Dustin Poirier. I mean, Dustin Poirier and Eddie Alvarez ultimately got the finish over him. He took a piece of them with him before he got KO'd by them.
Gaethje came out and was frank about his stance on fighting, that he's willing to put on a show and willing to take damage. But I do think since that Poirier fight particularly, he has approached his career with a bit more of a measured approach, because I think he realizes, like, I can actually be a title contender. You know, I don't just have to be here fighting for a paycheck. I can actually make a run, and by selecting the right fights and approaching the fights in the right way. Because even in those defeats, he wasn't blown away. These were flip of a coin in some instances, right?
Those fights with both Eddie Alvarez and Dustin Poirier, you could say, yeah, they were very close. They were highly contested. It was back and forth. But one thing I'm kind of stealing from Luke Thomas that he mentioned on his show is that both of those finishes happen around the same sort of time. They happened around the third round, where he started to get tired, and a lot of his defensive liabilities sort of cost him. And he had there were a lot of things where he would just like rush into the pocket, and he would stay in the pocket too long, and he wasn't defensively responsible. And you could say that these were back and forth fights, and it was a flip of a coin, but a little bit started to seem sort of systemic in terms of like when he was getting KO'd and some of the mistakes that he was making in both of those fights. But since then, like you said, since the Poirier fight, he's definitely cleaned up his act. He seems more balanced in his with his footwork, and he seems a bit more measured and a bit more of a sharpshooter. So he kind of like darts in. He has a bit more purpose when he goes into the pocket. I saw that in the Cerrone fight, and definitely saw that in the Edson Barbosa fight, where he's kind of a bit more selective with his shots, and he's always angling off when he exits the pocket, and he's a bit more defensively responsible. One thing though, also that with this Justin Gaethje fight, he's a collegiate wrestler. Do you know how many takedowns he's shot since his UFC debut?
Right? He's not
to
shot.
Now.
Zero. Right?
It's great. It's absolutely crazy that he hasn't even found himself in a scenario where he shot a takedown, and that's his bread and butter. That's what he started doing. If in this matchup with Tony Ferguson, if that's gonna cost
his kind of refusal to lean on his wrestling.
Yeah, I do.
So I think for fighters who have that wrestling credential and don't employ it, I think it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. And they'll employ it when they really need it, when the chips are down. And in his defeats, when he's been hurt, or even in the Michael Johnson fight where he was hurt, he ultimately won. He didn't go to his wrestling. You're almost at home screaming at the TV for him to shoot, and he doesn't do it. I think in a fight against Tony Ferguson, who himself is a college wrestler, almost certainly has a better ground game than Gaethje, is that even an option?
Not necessarily to. I mean, in those, let's say he gets hurt on the feet, right? Just to tie up, or just to even in those instances, he to be fair, actually, in his last fight with Donald Cerrone, he did show a tendency to, if he missed on a left hook, he would go to a collar tie, and then he would keep on pulling down on the head. What I mean is that I'm assuming that Justin Gaethje is still practicing wrestling. He's had Kamaru Usman and Beneil Dariush in his camp that he's training with. So I'm assuming that he's getting at least some grappling exposure. But what I mean is, like, if he's not doing it in the fights, you can make the assumption that isn't the focus during his training camps. So my only thing would be is, okay, if it's not a focus during his training camps, is someone like Tony Ferguson going to be able to capitalize on that? I guess that's the kind of angle that I'm coming from. Not necessarily in terms of his offensive wrestling, but if Tony Ferguson is able to sort of, chain wrestle, grapple, and want to trade takedowns or get into scrambles, I wonder if that's going to affect Justin Gaethje negatively.
Yeah, totally. I get it from a defensive perspective. Yeah, it's really interesting. So you mentioned Gaethje in his most recent couple of fights, his angling off out of the pocket, right? Which shows a defensive maturity that he's gained, since his earlier fights in the UFC. I have a observation about Ferguson in the same situation, right? If you notice Ferguson, he is very hittable when exiting the pocket. I think if you see when he gets hurt, it tends to be when he's coming out of the pocket. He doesn't show great defensive fundamentals. He'll often drop his hands, or he'll back out in a straight line. And I think, in the Pettis fight, he got hurt that way. And I mean, generally speaking, Tony gets hurt in every fight, right? in the last few fights, it's hard to find one where he didn't get hurt, he didn't get rocked.
It's not a Tony Ferguson fight until he gets rocked and then comes back and and beats the guy up. Same way as like Frankie Edgar. It was like, it's not a Frankie Edgar fight until his nose starts bleeding. So it's a kind of it's kind of similar.
Definitely,
thing
and you know, as much as he's got a very fan-friendly style because of that, and his fights are exciting, it makes me think that, you know, because of that propensity to getting hit, a lot of the time he wins fights. I'm not going to use this to undermine his skill set or his brilliance, but a lot of his victories really come from that pressure and that, like I said, taking people to that place that they cannot go, that deep water, right? People he's beaten recently, Pettis, Cerrone, they can't keep up with the pace. Going in with that approach against a guy like Justin Gaethje, who has shown he is also completely willing to live in that place. I think it negates a big strong point of Tony Ferguson, right? It doesn't make it a clear key to victory for Ferguson now, right? Because you've got a guy in front of you who will stay there, who will stay in the pocket, who will trade, and has got certified knockout power, one-punch knockout power, which we haven't really seen from Ferguson.
I mean, we saw it early in his career. As the opposition has increased, that knockout power hasn't shown itself. You know, Tony Ferguson has the ability to almost drown his opponents in strikes and just keep them not keep them guessing. I will say though, however, he has, you know, again in the Rafael dos Anjos fight, he showed a bit more a bit more smarts, and like he wasn't necessarily that pressure come forward fighter. And I wonder if he does take that approach in this fight. Obviously, he's had a bit more of a time to prepare, and he's had an extended training camp, and he's had time to think about his matchup with Justin Gaethje. So I mean, yeah, I'm super interested to see what this fight looks like when they both step in, and Bruce Buffer calls out both their names. I'm gonna be edge of my seat.
Absolutely. I'm just looking at Ferguson's record, right? And I mentioned Gaethje's record of bonuses, and Ferguson has 8 bonuses in his last 8 fights.
Yeah, I would be shocked if this isn't fireworks up until it ends. One of the storylines that I would like to sort of bring up before we go to our picks is the kind of under the radar fight. It's on the early prelims. It's Nico Price versus Vicente Luque. Now, I did talk about this in the last episode, but this fight has all the makings for fight of the night, I think. Now, everyone's going to say Sofia's stupid. Obviously, Gaethje versus Ferguson is going to be fight of the night, but I think these two, the way they fight and how crazy, how sort of the call to violence, basically they are happy to answer that at a moment's notice. So I'm super excited for this fight, and I'll be definitely tuning in. Yeah, I'll be watching the card from the beginning, but this fight I'll be really looking forward to, and I think this is definitely a sleeper on the card.
We speak about it being like this under the radar, exciting fight. It's being a rematch as well. It really offers Price the opportunity to kind of redeem himself. And yeah, when both of these guys step in, it really is fireworks. Nico Price is kill or be killed. From Luque, we do tend to see a bit more cerebral fight style, but I mean he's ending people in the first and second round all the time as well. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting. Obviously, for Luque, lost a lot of his momentum coming off that Wonderboy fight, which we did speak about in the last episode. But yeah, I completely agree with you. This is going to be a very entertaining fight, and I think for the casual, so first of all, I'm not going to use the term casual in a almost derogatory sense, right? When I say casual, I think it's the same for you. I mean it in someone who will, in the truest form of the word, someone who watches the sport occasionally, but is not sitting here doing a podcast on it when they're supposed to be working. So, so I think having that fight on the prelims is going to be a great way to get new eyes on the sport. And all right, so I think that pretty much covers all of our kind of storylines and breakdowns of the fights. So we're going to be back in part 2 for our picks. All right, everyone, welcome back to For Yogz, and you've made it back in time to listen to our first round of picks for the season, right? So this is our first card back to the UFC, and we're going to honor that by doing a full card of picks. Souph and I are going to go back and forth over the course of the year, and we're going to keep track on whose picks are the most successful And I don't know, maybe we're going to have a little prize at the end of the year. Who knows? So before we get started, I'd give you listeners a breakdown of the metrics for this challenge. So for picking the correct fighter, you get 1 point. For getting the right method, so that's decision, knockout, submission, etc., you get another point. And you get 2-point bonus if you get both correct. We decided not to go for round because it caused some complications around decisions and stuff. So 1 point for the correct fighter, 1 point for the correct method, and a +2 bonus if you get them both. We're going to start from the bottom of the prelims.
Okay, so for Uriah Hall and Ronaldo Souza, Jacare has more ways to win. He's beaten higher level opposition. And my pick is Jacare second round submission.
Nice into the Souza is on the downward slope at the moment, coming off 2 back-to-back defeats, and Hall seems to have really got his act together. I think we're going to see a really focused Uriah Hall. And while I agree that Souza probably has more ways to win in regards to the fact that, you know, he could survive on the feet and on the ground is no contest, I think we're going to see Hall with laser accurate striking. And I think we're going to see Hall take the victory by second round TKO.
The fight after the middleweight scrap between Uriah Hall and Souza is a women's strawweight bout between Carla Esparza and Michelle Waterson.
All right, cool. So, interesting matchup. I think Esparza has looked great as of late, and she is going to exert her will over Waterson with the wrestling. I think Waterson's striking doesn't tend to be able to keep off stronger opponents, keep them at bay, and she has that karate style which tends to rely on movement. I see this being a scrap that goes the distance, with Carla Esparza exerting a lot of control against the cage and grinding out a decision victory. Esparza by decision. Who have you got, Souph?
Okay, for me, Michelle Waterson has enough in the grappling arena to pose some threats to Carla Esparza, and I think enough striking and distance control. I'm going to go Michelle Waterson by a close decision.
All right, cool. So next up is Olenek versus Vadum. Obviously, we got into this a little bit earlier on with some of the storylines that are there. A fight that is almost certainly going to be grappling-centric. So, Souph, who have you got?
This one's an easy one for me. It's going to be round 1 submission victory for Fabricio Verdum.
Not much else to say there, is there?
There's not much else to say.
As I detailed earlier, Olenek only wins by submission pretty much, and that's not guaranteed path to victory against Verdum. So for me, I see this being a fight that takes form of being 2 strikers essentially now, 2 grapplers that decide to strike for 3 rounds, and I see it being a decision victory for Fabricio Verdum.
And then on the main event of the preliminary card, we have Anthony Pettis versus Donald Cowboy Cerrone.
So pretty interesting matchup. Definitely one for the fans. The interesting thing about this fight is that it can go anywhere, and both guys will be fine. It can go to the ground. Both guys have got good jiu-jitsu. It can stay on the feet. Both guys have got entertaining striking. For me, I think Pettis is really at the end of his career. I think he's just really here for the paycheck. And I feel like Cerrone just brings a little bit more tenacity and desire to win to the fight. I can see Cerrone winning this one, and I'm going to say that he stops Pettis in round 3.
Okay, so this fight between Pettis and Cerrone, I mean, it's crazy to think that Pettis dispatched Cerrone in a matter of minutes in their first meeting. You know, how different of a fighter Pettis looks like in the last couple of fights. I think Donald Cerrone by decision.
All right, and that brings us on to the pay-per-view. Started off with 2 big heavyweight swangers and bangers, and that is Greg Hardy versus Yorgan De Castro. All right, so who have you got?
I think for me, I would just really like to see Yorgan De Castro blast Greg Hardy into the nether realm. So I'm going to say Yorgan De Castro by round 1 knockout.
Right, for me, I think what we've seen from Castro, and as you mentioned earlier, he's not a huge heavyweight, finds a way to close the distance on Hardy and land that overhand right and put him to sleep. Second round, KO De Castro.
Next up on the main card, we have a featherweight match between Jeremy, who the fuck is that guy, Stevens, and
oh man, I love
Calvin
this
Kattar.
matchup. I'm high on Kattar.
Who you got, Lewis?
He's got really good hands. He loves establishing that jab early and he used it really effectively. In the Lamas fight, he mixed up his punches really well, established the jab early, and then opened up the body and attacked the body well. He defends kicks really well, which I think is a skill that goes kind of underrated. And in that same Lamas fight, he really hurt Lamas from kicking a leg kick. And I think that will come into play against Stevens, who is a fan of his heavy kicks. Another one of his fights against Fishgold, he showed amazing composure in the pocket against the power puncher. And against Stevens really likes to come out swinging. So I can see Kata being able to absorb the punishment in the pocket, get out and really work his slick boxing. I love this fight on paper. And I think this could be a coming out party for Kata. I see him outclassing Stevens over 3 rounds and taking a decision.
I agree with all those points. I think Jeremy Stevens he's obviously a devastating power puncher when he lands, but in his recent fights, he hasn't landed that often. Calvin Kattar is definitely the more polished striker out of the two. Not as devastating necessarily, but he's got a lot of tools, and he really impressed me in the outing with Zabit Magomedsharipov, despite losing in that fight. So, yeah, I agree with you.
Jairzinho Rozenstruik and Francis Ngannou. How do you see this one going down, Souph?
Rozenstruik called out Ngannou. I mean, big props to him. He's got the minerals. But I somehow, just from the Overeem fight, he was getting caught with some massive shots. Granted, Overeem is a highly credentialed striker, and you would expect him to land early and often on pretty much any heavyweight in the division. But if he gets caught with any of those shots from Francis Ngannou, I don't see him taking them as well. So I've got Francis Ngannou.
Very nice, thank you.
Okay,
count me in, please. Rewatching the Rozenstruik and Overeem fight, Overeem had his way with him, landed several takedowns, and Rozenstruik showed no ability to get to his feet. He got dominated in the clinch against the cage, and he ate so many straight left hands from Overeem. Rozenstruik keeps his hands very low, which was worrying. And against a guy like Ngannou, who has the athleticism and power to A, get to the target, and B, put anyone to sleep, that's a recipe for disaster. I think Ngannou is going to go in there and do what he's been doing in his last few fights and really remind people how good he is. I see this one being a first-round knockout for Ngannou.
Now, we're at the co-main event. And this fight, obviously we talked about the storylines heading into it between Dominic Cruz and Henry Cejudo.
Loving this, man. So like I said earlier, I don't see Cejudo as a cultured striker to take Cruz 5 rounds and outpoint him. But Cruz's start was so reliant on his mobility and his ability to get in and out of the pocket. The big question is his body going to let him do that after 4 years out of the game? And that's really the big intangible. What we have seen is that Cejudo can land power punches. He has the athleticism to get to the target. It's a difficult one. I don't see him being able to clinch up with Cruz. I think that Cruz is too good at maintaining distance from the clinch and has enough wrestling credentials not to get tied up. I don't see him tiring the way Moraes did. And I think he's going to be able to pick Cejudo off from the outside. And we're going to be looking at a new champion and possibly the greatest story ever told, Cruz by decision. So how do you see this one going down?
Okay, Lewis. I've had trouble with this pick. I've gone back and forth throughout the week. I think ultimately the odds makers do have it right with having Henry Cejudo as your favourite going in. But I don't know, man. There's just something in the air, and I'm not just talking coronavirus. There's something in the air about this card. It's I think we're gonna get an upset. I think Dominic Cruz is gonna become your new bantamweight champion after a hard-fought decision against Henry Cejudo. Now, the pick's not particularly scientific or technical. It's just this feeling I've got going into this fight.
On to the main event. So much has been said about this fight. Very fan-friendly style. Interim lightweight championship on the line. Sufyan, who do you have? Tony Ferguson or Justin Gaethje?
This is a tough one, man. I've gone back and forth on this one. I thought that Justin Gaethje could play spoiler and destroy that dream matchup between Khabib and Ferguson that all fans have been anticipating. But I think at the end of the day, Tony Ferguson is the better fighter. I think he has more tools. I think he's beaten better opposition. I think he has just shown himself to be, when push comes to shove, he's shown time and time again that he's not going to be bested or for almost a decade. So my pick is Tony Ferguson by submission. And if we're going rounds, I'm going to say 3rd round.
Wow, Ferguson by 3rd round submission. What we go for? Anaconda, Das? What we got?
Yeah, because he ain't. Justin Gaethje doesn't strike me as someone who's gonna be tapping to any arm bars.
No, don't take this arm and take the other one too.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that if he's gonna get a submission, it's gonna have to be a choke, and I think Tony Ferguson will oblige him. And okay, Lewis, what about you? Main event, who you got?
Dude, this is one of those ones they'll get you rich, cuz.
It's one of them things, cuz.
You mentioned in the last one for your pick with Cruz that it might be part emotion. And for me, this is really an emotional pick. I'm really invested in Tony Ferguson as a fighter, as a personality, everything that he's gone through in the last couple of years, getting the interim title, losing it, the fights with Khabib falling through, personal issues with mental health, injury, etc. It's really hard to pick him on other than Ferguson in this fight. As you mentioned in the breakdown, he does tend to get hit coming out of the pocket, and possibly his greatest strength is his ability to take people to places that they don't want to be. I think against Justin Gaethje, that's going to be a lot harder than it is against some of his most recent opponents. I think we've seen Ferguson get hurt in numerous fights and still find a way to win. So with that in mind, I see this one ended in the third round by KO with Justin Gaethje the winner. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah, man.
Okay.
I hate to say it.
Came out of left field. Okay.
Yeah, man. I honestly, like you, back and forth on this one. Like, my heart says Tony. I think even my brain says Tony. He is the better fighter. I just think Gaethje's the fucker that wants to come in and ruin the party. He's a little shit. Yeah, man. He's a little shit at primary school of head lice. Do you know what I mean? That fucks up for everybody else. I mean, the little...
Coming up to
do you know what I mean? Like,
Nitty
Justin.
And I mean, this is the thing. I picked Tony, but would I be surprised if Justin Gaethje lands a left hook or an overhand right over a lazy jab from Ferguson? No, I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, I think I definitely understand why you made the pick. But yeah, I just decided to lean on.
If I'm going to speak about technical points of the fight, I think one thing we're going to see is that them heavy leg kicks from Justin Gaethje. I think it's going to really limit Tony's movement as the fight goes on. And for somebody that exits the pocket sloppily anyway, that is going to be problematic. And I do see Tony Ferguson getting caught exiting the pocket, maybe with a head kick, maybe with an overhand, but that's how I see it going. So, yeah.
Well, Lewis, man, that was a lot of fun. This whole podcast has been a lot of fun, actually. I'm super excited, as I'm sure you are as well, to have MMA and UFC back in our lives.
I would agree completely. There's nothing like the build up to fight week, and being able to make these picks with you makes it even more exciting. So much to go through. There's even 2 more cards next week that we didn't even talk about. So maybe when we jump back on mic next time, we can discuss those ones too. Yeah. Until the next time, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for subscribing. This has been the 4 Yogz. I'm Lewis.
And I've been Souph.
Peace.